Well, welcome everybody to today's CSSGJ event, part of our autumn 2022 seminar series. My name is Oliver Dodd, a PhD candidate in political economy and one of 3 co-directors based at the Center for the Study of Social and Global Justice. The CSSGJ are very pleased to be welcoming today's speaker, Tanja Nijmeijer. Tanja Nijmeijer was born and grew up in the Netherlands, where she studied Romance languages and cultures. In year 2000, during a university exchange in Colombia, she got to know the reality on the ground in Colombia, including the armed conflict and the existence of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, a socialist guerrilla movement more commonly known as the FARC. In year 2000, Tanja joined the guerrilla forces of the FARC, where she became a political military combatant and performed various activities, including teaching English and Marxist philosophy to guerrilla combatants, as well as becoming completely immersed in the daily activities of guerrilla life in the Colombian jungle. In year 2012, after spending a decade confronting the most powerful counterinsurgency army in Latin America and being subject to various US-sponsored targeted attacks, Tanja joined the negotiations between the Colombian government and the FARC guerrillas in Cuba for 4 years. Following the signing of the 2016 peace agreement, Tanja lived in a transition area for the decommissioning of weapons and reincorporation of ex-guerrilla fighters in the western regions of Colombia. Since then, Tanja has completed a master's degree in interculturality, development and territorial peace at Javana University in Cali, Colombia. Tanja is currently undertaking a PhD at the University of the Basque Country on social representations of the enemy during the conflict in Colombia. Tanja continues to be politically engaged, corresponding words into deeds. She is currently working to support the reintegration of ex-FARC guerrillas in Colombia, organizing peace cooperatives as a way of challenging capitalist social relations of production. Tanja has numerous publications to her name, as well as recently publishing a book on her experiences over the years. Some of Tanja's academic articles include The Territorial Dimension of the Peace Agreement with the FARC-EP, The International Community, and Essential Support for the Implementation of the Peace Agreement. The agreements are to be fulfilled, commitments of the FARC-EP and its successor political organization to the peace agreement. Despite being censored and suppressed by those who pay lip service to human rights, peacemaking, and democracy, the CSSGJ is very pleased and proud to be welcoming Tanja Nijmeijer today, a signatory to Colombia's 2016 peace agreement and a true internationalist. Tanja's talk is titled The FARC-EP, a prolonged struggle for power in Colombia. Tanja, you have approximately 45 minutes for your talk, and we'll follow this with a similar amount of time. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Oliver. Welcome everybody, and thank you very much for being here. Well, I wanted to introduce myself, but I don't have anything to add to what Oliver just said. No, he said it. He said everything. Less that I'm living in Cali, that I'm having 3 dogs and 2 cats. That's about it. He introduced me very well. So I was asked to give a talk about the FARC-EP, about what we were until the peace agreements in 2016. So I called it the FARC-EP, a prolonged struggle for power in Colombia. Boris? Puedes pasar a la siguiente, por favor. Okay, so I wanted to start with like some general context about the FARC-EP. I think some of you might know already a lot, some of you might not. So I just wanted to give some very basic information. The FARC was officially born in 1964 after the US-backed intervention in Marquetalia. where 48 peasants resisted against 16,000 soldiers. In 1949, after a long period of state-sponsored violence, there was a period called La Violencia in Colombia. The Communist Party ordered to create self-defense forces. So the guerrillas officially started as self-defense forces. Communist groups of self-defense peasant forces were created in the south of Tolima, which is a department in the center of Colombia. And in 1961, the Communist Party approved the thesis of combining all methods of struggle. After that, the government started to attack what they called the independent republics in Marquetalia in 1962. In 1964, President Guillermo León Valencia, he decided to attack Marquetalia with 16,000 soldiers backed by the US. 48 peasants resisted the attack, and they founded what was called the South Bloc, which became FARC in 1966 during the Second National Guerrilla Conference. Okay, so this is the foundation of the FARC in a nutshell. There's a lot more about it, but I just wanted to provide some context. So an important thing to notice is that the maximum authority within the FARC was not, as many people believe, its secretariat, but it's the National Guerrilla Conference. That means that strategic decisions would be taken at those conferences. There were 10 in total during history. And the Central High Command with its secretariat would be in charge of the daily management of the FARC and taking daily decisions, always within the guidelines and the orientations of those conferences. The FARC had 3 basic documents. We had a lot of documents, of course, but those were the 3 basic documents that would regulate our daily functioning: the regulatory rules, the statutes, and the norms of command. The statutes were like an explanation of what the FARC was fighting for. The regulatory rules, el reglamento, were like rules for coexistence of fighters. For example, sexual violence would be, you would go to a war council. For example, to have a fight with a compañero in ranks would be punished with, I don't know, with doing 3 cooking turns and writing something, self-criticizing yourself. Stuff like that. And the norms of command would be like the daily rules for living. For example, how do you pay a guard duty? What can you do within the ranks? What can't you do within the ranks? All that kind of stuff. What time do you go to bed? For example, those very simple things. When you would join the FARC army, you would automatically join the clandestine Communist Party, the PC3. The military squad you joined was at the same time a political cell. And this political cell had its meeting every week or every 2 weeks. When things got very difficult, it could be once a month or something like that. But there were regular meetings of those cells. The military commander of the squad was excluded from the possibility of being one of the 3 secretaries of the cell in order to guarantee internal democracy. We had a political secretary, a cultural secretary, and an educational secretary. So those people couldn't be commanders, military commanders. Those meetings would consist of a political, educational part, an informative part, and proposals and critiques and self-critiques. There would also be a daily military relation. So people would form up, the commander would be in front of us and he would ask, is there something you want to say? And you could get out of the formation and say, I want to inform my commander who made a mistake today, or I want to ask for a pair of boots. or I want to organize a theater for Sunday, stuff like that. Very like punctual stuff. And people could inform stuff in a much shorter way. And there would be like a very short answer to that as well. And I wanted to tell you very shortly about peace processes and attempts that have been made to come to peace with the FARC, between the FARC and the government. And there was the 1984 Uribe agreements with President Betancourt. There were attempts in Caracas, in Tlaxcala. They started in Caracas and they were transferred to Tlaxcala in 1991 with President Cesar Gaviria, which was actually with the Coordinadora Guerrillera, with a group made up of different guerrilla groups who came together in order to make peace. And there were also attempts in El Caguán, which is better known because it was more recently. It was started in 1999 with President Pastrana. And finally, the Havana peace talks with President Santos, which ended up in the signing of the peace accords. We're going to talk about that later on. I also think it's good for you to know what happened in the decade of the 1980s. In the 1980s, the FARC made an attempt to create a political party. It was called Unión Patriótica, Patriotic Union. At least 4,000 militants, sympathizers, members, leaders were killed in what would be known later as a political genocide. And I believe it's necessary to know about that because it was a major reason for the FARC to continue its armed struggle. It was like telling the FARC, yeah, you can't participate in politics because that means you're going to be killed. So you have to go to the jungle. And finally, something about Colombian Plan Patriota, which was in 2001, when Plan Colombia started, which was a US-backed military counterinsurgency project in which the US invested $10 billion between 2001 and 2016. I think it's, if not the country they most spent money on, it's one of those countries. And Plan Patriota was a further development of Plan Colombia. It was started by President Uribe in 2002 to combat guerrilla groups in Colombia. In the jungle, we very much noticed the start of Plan Patriota and also the changes in military technology and high precision bombings and everything. Again, I think there's a lot to tell and to say about this, but I just wanted to provide a general overview and we can get back to stuff if you want to in the question part. Next slide, yes, about women in the FARC-EP. I wanted to say something about it because I'm a woman and I think it's important to mention it because approximately 25% of the FARC-EP or 30%, it's not really clear, but when we came out of the jungle, how do you say that? Interviews? No, an investigation was being held and it was approximately 25% women in 2016. More or less since the 80s, there was a massive recruitment of women. Women have always been in the FARC, but in the beginning, there were very little amount of women and they didn't like participate in all military actions, activities. But later on, since the 80s, they were massively joining the FARC and they got to participate like men in the war and in everything around it. So there are several reasons that make Colombian women want to join the FARC. In the first place, and this is also for men, poverty is a very, and I think legitimate reason to join the FARC. There's also like the example of independent, strong female guerrilla fighters coming by their houses and seeing those guerrilla fighters as an example. They mention it very often. There's also, I've known many cases of sexual abuse at home. So a lot of women also used like to flee their homes into the guerrilla camps. There's one example of my best friend who joined the guerrilla when she was 12 because she was sexually violated by her dad, and she just fled her home. And there's also like in the countryside, it's very normal for women to marry when they're 13, 14, to have children. And for many women, I think just having a future of being married and having a lot of children at a very young age, and don't be able like to have any future perspective or any education, made them join the FARC. And the last thing, I wanted to say something about treatment of women within the FARC, because there's a lot of media attention always on sexual abuses within the FARC ranks. But in the FARC, I knew that was impossible, because all women would carry a weapon, and if someone would try to assault us, we would like blow his head off. When they're speaking about sexual abuses, they're also speaking about abortion. And I think abortion is and has been another thorny issue about which I have changed my opinion radically. Abortion in some areas, for example, in mine, was mandatory. And also contraceptive methods were mandatory. So when I was in the jungle, I didn't really reflect on the psychological and physical consequences of abortion. And I just thought about the impossibility of having babies with us in the jungle. But now I do believe that women should be free to decide over their body. I'm pro-abortion, but against forced abortion. And in my region, it was mandatory. That said, I still believe that the treatment of women within the FARC was better than in Colombian society, especially because in the FARC, women would be economically independent. Everybody depended on the organization for their uniforms, their food, their daily stuff. That made us independent. In Colombian society, there's so many women who depend economically on their husbands, who get drunk, beat them up, waste money, disrespect them, but they still have to like obey in some way. They can't leave. Also, men and women would carry out the same tasks, carry the same weight on their shoulders. So I wouldn't say machismo as we know it, or patriarchy, didn't exist within the FARC, because it did, but at least something would be done to stop it. That said, it's a historical fact that women were not part, and I think it's also important to underline this, were not part of the central high command of the FARC until 2016, almost until the end. So something like equality is okay, but we don't want to share power with you. And that is something I started to question a lot in a later stage. Okay. So a political struggle or terrorist attacks. So these are questions that people ask me a lot. So I thought I would include it in this presentation, as there are two basic views on the Colombian conflict. One is the view that the FARC was a legitimate political rebellion struggle as a response to a tyrannic state, speak in the terms of the Declaration of Independence of the United States of all countries. The other one is the view that for more than half a century, there was a group that wanted to destabilize the Colombian state through terrorist attacks. And a more moderate viewpoint now, and I believe this is the most popular among social democrats, which are majority in the world, is the middle course of a guerrilla army that started as a legitimate peasant army, but grew out through the years into a narco-terrorist army of bandits or criminals. Although my personal view is that there's some truth in saying that drug trafficking, and especially like the whole culture around drug trafficking, has had a negative impact on the struggle as a whole. I don't believe at all that FARC therefore lost its political goals or became a narco gang. There are many indicators of the contrary. So I think also that during the peace process, there was a de facto recognition of the FARC's political struggle when we started the peace talks. Like the United States would send its special envoy to the peace talks. The European Union would send its special envoy to the peace talks. But also like the agenda. We're going to have a look at the agenda later on. And the peace talks were about rural reform. It was about political participation. It was about victims. So why are you even talking about rural reform if you're talking to a terrorist organization? Why are you even talking about political participation with a terrorist organization? So I believe it's a de facto recognition of our political struggle. And I also think it is important to briefly address the concept of terrorism and the ambiguity that surrounds the concept. There are many examples of freedom fighters who became terrorists, depending on the political interest or the context in which they were fighting. The best known example might be the case of the Taliban, of course, when they were called Mujahideen in the 80s. First they were called freedom fighters, and then they're called terrorists. Also the Palestinians, they're in a legitimate resistance according to the UN, called terrorists by Israel. The ANC, maybe the example that best applies to FARC. It was a terrorist organization until 2008, and they're now considered legitimate combatants against apartheid. So there are many definitions of terrorism, but what becomes clear is that groups end up on that list of terrorist organizations of the US whenever it suits them. And they end up on the list of terrorist organizations of the European Union whenever the US includes them. So that about terrorism. I think it's a very ambiguous concept. A third point I wanted to address is like the two facets, let's call it like that, of an armed struggle. There's a political struggle for power, there's a strategic plan, there's a Marxist class struggle that we adhere to, there's the programs, there's the party, there's the organizational work of the FARC in its communities, the political relations built up during so many years, the education, etc. But when there's an armed struggle, there's also something many people forget about, especially when they criticize the FARC from behind their desks because we betrayed class struggle or we became revisionists. An armed struggle includes the use of weapons. It's war. It's as simple as that, and it produces death, a high toll on the population and on the people who are directly involved, but especially the population. A class struggle is about creating insurrectional conditions for a takeover of power, to win the population for your cause. And if the struggle is prolonged, it takes very long, people get fed up with it, they get tired, they get exhausted, then you're not doing anything anymore. And if you already know that neither side is going to win the war, then it becomes problematic, or I could even say criminal, to continue with it, causing death and more death and more death. I mean, violence should take us somewhere, and if not, it becomes inhumane in a way. And that takes me to the issue of victims. I also wanted to touch upon. The civil war in Colombia has cost more than 260,000 deaths. When entering a peace process, the issue of victims is a very thorny one. Nobody wants to recognize the victims made by his own party. Everybody enters the peace process saying that the victims were made on the other side. I believe in Colombia, we had a unique happening in Havana. We had 5 meetings with victims, 12 victims for each meeting, and they would tell their story to 10 representatives of the FARC, 10 representatives of the government, victims from all sides, and they would tell their very impressive stories. And I think it was maybe a turning point for the government and also for the FARC, like to see that victims were made by both sides, and to look victims in the eyes and to recognize that your own party has also made victims. I think that was something that was very important for both parties, but especially for the FARC. Okay, so Boris, okay. So I wanted to say something about 2012 peace talks with the Santos government. This is a picture of President Santos with Raúl Castro, who was how do you say that? A guarantor country of the peace process, and Timoleon Jiménez, who was the commander-in-chief of the FARC at the moment. Boris? Okay, so I wanted to say something about the agenda. The agenda was made up of 6 points. The first point was comprehensive rural reform. So it addressed a cause of the conflict, and for the FARC it was a very important point because, like, the call for land reform had been in our agrarian program since 1964, so it was a very specifically significant point. Then the second one was political participation. That point was not about political participation for the FARC, as many people believe. It was about political participation for society, and especially for those people on the countryside and those people like communities, poor people who had never had the possibility of participating in politics. In Colombia, politics has been an elite thing. The third point, which actually was the last one we discussed, was end of conflict, which included the whole decommissioning of weapons, but also the dismantling of paramilitary organizations. The fourth point was the solution to the problem of illicit drugs. There was an agreement on voluntary substitution of illicit drugs within that point, but also it was also about consuming drugs and everything, but the main point was to make coca growers substitute their crops in a voluntary way. The fifth point was about victims. That point included the Peace Tribunal, the JEP, the Truth Commission, a commission for the search of missing people during the conflict, and there were also some reparation measures within that point. And the last point was about implementation and verification of the peace accords, which was, according to the agreement, done by different organizations from the international community. For example, for each point of the agreement, there would be 2 or 3 organizations who would verify the implementation of that specific point. Ya puedes seguir. Okay, so something about the implementation of the agreements. Since not till 2016, the agreement was signed in 2016. You see a picture here of José Alirio. We knew very well, which was the last ex-fighter who was killed day before yesterday. So right now there have been 342 ex-fighters killed since the signing of the peace agreement. Many productive projects have been set up, individual projects and also collective projects. But I don't think none of these projects, or maybe very few, have been able to provide sustainability or to provide a living from it. You know, that was the idea of the whole thing about setting up productive projects. Like the government would give a certain amount of money to each ex-fighter to set up his productive project and to be able to have to not live from the monthly subsidy from the government. And that didn't happen. I think all ex-fighters, most of the ex-fighters depend on the monthly subsidy. So they're made very dependent on the government, which is not desirable. The political party, for me, it's difficult to talk about that because I left the political party like 2 years ago, but I think we can come to the conclusion that it hasn't been very successful in terms of militancy, in terms of growth, and also in terms of electoral results. It hasn't been very successful, and I'm going to leave it there. Rural reform has seen a partial implementation. There's some programs that have been implemented with participation of the communities, but there's a lot of criticism on those programs. It's a partial implementation. It very much consisted of things the government already had to implement on the countryside. So people are not really positive about the rural reform. The voluntary substitution of the crops started very promising, but many people, many families, like 98% of them was willing to substitute their crops. And in the end, there was so much that the government didn't have money for it. And they just made people like give up on their crops, and they didn't give them anything in turn. Like some people complain about receiving 5 chicken in return for their crops, so they can't live from it. The Peace Tribunal, the Truth Commission are working in spite of many difficulties from the former government. But I think they did a good job. Of course, all parties of the conflict always say they didn't, because everybody wants his like historical narrative reflected in those reports. But I think at least we can say that the victims have been central in the Truth Commission and also within the GEP, in the Peace Tribunal. There have been made some changes on the Peace Tribunal by the former government, by the Duque government, which were very problematic for us to accept. In a way, we didn't have a choice. We had to accept it. For example, the very important little detail that third persons, you call it in Spanish, I don't know if in English you would understand me, like people who didn't carry a weapon, but did finance the conflict and did instigate the conflict, they had to go to the Peace Tribunal as well. And the government, the former government, said no, they're not going to go in a mandatory way to the Peace Tribunal. They're just they're just going if they want to. So it's a voluntary question, and I think that's something that's very important. You know, it's a Peace Tribunal shouldn't be only for those of us who carried weapons, but most of the time, like those people who finance the conflict bear a lot of responsibility. So I think it's important they have to go to the Peace Tribunal as well. So I think we can say in a general way that those points that were consequences of the conflict, like end of conflict, like reintegration of ex-combatants, like victims, were being implemented partially, and those points that are causes of the conflict, they were implemented taking care of not touching upon power structures or land properties. You know, it's the elites who have had power in this country, and it shouldn't like change. Okay, Boris. So, conclusion, very shortly, implementation should be timely. It should be on time. I think a major problem with the implementation was that it took very long. It took the Santos government very long to make things go through Congress and to make laws to be able to implement the peace process. So it's very important to have some timely measures like of implementation, also for reintegration of ex-combatants. That's very important. I mean, we were living in those ETCRs, in those transition zones, and there was not a sign of any education for a year. So after 1 year, education would start in those zones, and a lot of people just left the zones. And I know when I arrived to my zone, for example, many people were very enthusiastic about education. They wanted education, but it was very slow. It was not on time. It didn't come on time. Implementation should be comprehensive. I think it's important the peace agreement was signed in such a way that it was important to have a comprehensive implementation. So the fourth point of the agenda depended on the first point of the agenda, but also like reintegration of ex-combatants dependent on rural reform. Reintegration and security for ex-combatants depended on the dismantling of paramilitary organizations. So everything depended on everything. It was all integrated. And if you only like implement some pieces of the peace accords, only the pieces you want to and you believe are suitable for you to maintain in power, then it's not going to work. And that's what happened. It didn't work. And also, like, it's necessary to have political will to implement the peace agreement. I think nobody maybe expected when we were discussing and negotiating peace in Havana, that there would be an extreme right government after the government who was signatory of the peace agreement. But he came, and very difficult times arrived for the peace agreement. But I put a picture here of our new president, President Petro, and Vice President Francia Marquez, who I believe do have political will to implement the peace agreement, and have also an understanding of the need for timely and comprehensive implementation of the peace agreement. So we are very hopeful. At least I am very hopeful. I think the implementation is going to happen with this government. I don't know if I have any time left, Oliver.
Yeah, feel free. 5 minutes. If you could wrap up in 5 minutes, that would be great.
Okay. I don't think so.
Well, take 10 minutes. Say 10 minutes maximum. Just take as much as 10 minutes. You know.
Yes, I just, because I could like cut off here, but I wanted to tell something about the research I'm doing. Puedes pasar, Boris. So I'm going to try to be very short. So I did my master degree on representations, social representations of the enemy. And my reflection behind starting that investigation was that all revolutionary struggle in the world are counter-systemic struggles, and they receive a response from all the pillars that hold up the capitalist system, like the military, like the media, like the educational system, like the church, and so on. And I thought the FARC may not have lost the military fight. That's why we went to a peace process. But I do believe that the FARC lost the ideological fight. That is reflected not only in the media and in public opinion, but also in the scholarly literature. There are many dominant ideas and like characterizations like of the FARC that obscure the lived experience of thousands of ex-combatants, among them me. I have read many academic papers on the recent reintegration process of ex-combatants, and the majority deploy very narrow assumptions as a starting point for examining the nature of the insurgency and the conflict in Colombia. But for example, they talk about the hatred that was being taught in the ranks of the FARC. So that's why I decided to carry out my own research on social representations of the enemy in former FARC fighters. That's when I identified 4 categories of enemies. The first one is a brother soldier or class brothers. It's like the way in which the FARC taught within the ranks, and also like told people to see soldiers as their class brothers, which is quite unique in the world. I don't know if there's another example of an army which actually tries to teach their people to see the enemy as class brothers. And there's also a category which is the paramilitary, which is much more traditional. Like you can see hatred in ex-fighter when talking about paramilitary. You don't see that hatred when they're talking about soldiers, which is very kind of significant, I believe. And the main enemy for ex-fighters was the state. There's also an enemy which there isn't much theory about it, which are the defectors and infiltrators, but are very present in the heads of people, because like daily practice, we had to do a lot with defectors and people from the army who would infiltrate the ranks of the FARC. So, la última. So my investigation led me to 4 key findings. The first finding is that the social representation of the enemy continues to be political for ex-combatants. When speaking about reintegration of FARC ex-combatants, the important thing is not to deconstruct hatred, because the social representation was and is still political. The essence of what many ex-fighters believe today about the enemy is political. So that also takes me to make conclusions about today, about reintegration. For example, the interventions carried out by the state should include a comprehensive understanding of what the enemy represented for FARC ex-combatants. Hatred or violence wasn't taught within the ranks. It wasn't taught as a way of resolving conflict, strangely enough. You know, it's like conflict and war outside, but within the FARC, there were other methods, like internal conflicts were resolved through sanctions, which included physical work. They also included intellectual work, like writing something, and self-criticizing. The second finding relates to reconciliation. So the essence of reconciliation after a peace process is not between 2 armed enemies, be them guerrillas, soldiers, or guerrillas, paramilitaries. The essential reconciliation in this case is between the guerrilla fighters and the state, which were our main enemies. So this might be quite obvious when we consider that the guerrilla took up arms against the state, but the practice of reconciliation in Colombia revolves around non-state armed actors. And the armed focus, like the armed people are the ones who should reconcile with the victims, of course. This detail of being the state, our main enemy, is largely ignored in Colombian society. For example, there was a meeting of the Truth Commission some time ago between a high-ranking commander of the FARC and a high-ranking commander of the paramilitary. So these are examples of what I think is important, but maybe it should also be important to keep an eye on what the state was for FARC fighters. Third finding is about state and reintegration. The state is a key party in it has a negative effect on reintegration processes. Reintegration means to leave behind a collective life, which constituted a central part of the FARC culture. So now we have to reintegrate, like leave that collective life aside, start an individual reintegration with the state in charge of our reintegration. So you could ask yourself if that's desirable, you know, and many people who I interviewed have a very negative perception of the governmental agency for reintegration. So it would be good to think about that as well. And there's also the fourth finding is that feelings of hatred were stronger before people joined the FARC. Many people would join the FARC because of feelings of vengeance, because the state or the paramilitary killed my family. And they, at least the people I interviewed, they say that in some way the FARC helped them to politicize, I don't know if that's a word, the social representation of the enemy, and that they changed the hatred into class struggle. Also, the social representation within the FARC has been pretty static. I've found no major changes in that field. The major outcome is that class struggle is still a very strong facet in ex-fighters' worldview, and that it means a major obstacle in people's reintegration processes. And this is something that should be kept in mind by government and organizations when they're designing reintegration programs. So that's what my research is about, Oliver. I would leave it here. And I'm very much willing to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Tanja. That was really interesting, really insightful talk, and to hear about your research as well. Just to say that, I mean, I've been very impressed on my field work in Colombia, talking to ex-FARC guerrillas, how frank and honest and self-critical they are, especially when we compare that with political organizations traditionally who engage in propaganda. But the FARC, former FARC, have been extremely honest, and I think your talk reflects that today. And it's really good to hear from a protagonist involved in the armed conflict, and I think we need to do it more, and a peace signatory as well. So we're going to open up to questions now. There's two ways we can do this today. You can either ask your question via text, or you could also ask the question directly. I've allowed people to unmute themselves, and so if people would like to ask a question directly, that's fine. So I'll, if you know, if one of the people want to put their video cameras on, so we can get in a bit of a seminar, a friendly seminar format, that would be really cool. Who would like to ask the first question to get things started in the Q&A? If you want to stick your hand up. Anyone? If not, I will have to abuse chair's privileges. Yep, we've got one question. Andreas, over to you.
Yes, thanks a lot, Tanja, for the very impressive talk and the insight into the peace process.
I should probably write the questions down. One moment, please.
I wait for a sec, no worries.
Okay, go ahead.
No, thanks a lot for the very impressive talk and the kind of emotions, but also tactical thinking underpinning the peace agreement. So you said you were very hopeful, but you also mentioned that there have been now 345, I think it was, ex-combatants who have been killed since the peace agreement. How do you deal with this kind of situation? How can you negotiate it and see a kind of a positive way forward in such a situation where there's so much political assassination still occurring in Colombia?
Can I just answer at once, Oliver?
How would you prefer? Would you prefer to do it one-to-one, or yeah, that's fine. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. It might seem a little bit maybe a contradiction. Like, many people have been killed, and how can I be helpful? Well, it's very difficult to deal with. It's very demoralizing for people. Like, another one got killed, you know, and also people, for example, this last guy, he was such a very good guerrilla fighter, and people loved him very much. So those are very difficult moments for us, you know. Within the war, it would be normal for people to die, almost normal, you know, and it also would be like the sacrifice you would make, and you were within a war, and you also had a weapon to fight with. But right now we are unarmed, and it's very painful when people get killed. But still, I think the fact that Petro won the elections, he is an ex-fighter as well. And not only that, like the discourse he has and the way in which he understands like the peace accords and understands the way they should be implemented, but also the way in which he addresses the communities, in which he addresses ex-fighters, the people he appointed in the government. Like, I think like following politics, you get quite positive about what could come out of the peace agreement, and also about new peace talks with ELN, new peace talks with the FARC dissidencies. There are surely coming up questions about that. So I think he understands that peace is only possible if it's a total peace. He speaks about total peace, and I think that's very intelligent. You know, it's not about making peace with just one group so other groups can continue and like kill the ones who make peace. That's not the essence of making peace. So I think this government is clear about it, and that's what makes me hopeful.
Thank you.
John, over to you, mate. If you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear us? Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks very much for that, Tanja. Really interesting. I'm a PhD student looking at Britain's role in the conflict in Colombia. And I was wondering what your perspective of Britain's role in the conflict was. You know, you said at one point that, you know, everybody that was, you know, involved in the conflict financially or militarily, you know, had a responsible role for the peace process as well. So yeah, I was wondering what the FARC's perspective of Britain's role was in the conflict, what yours was as well, and also Britain's role in the peace process, if that was kind of congruous with its role in the conflict.
I only understood like the last part of the question, like Britain's role in the peace process, but before that.
In the conflict as well, yeah, in the conflict. So for example, their counterinsurgency support, for example, you know, their support for the Colombian state, Britain's role generally in the conflict.
Okay, so I think the major support for the conflict has always come from the United States, which has like been a natural almost ally, and also like keeping an eye on that backyard, what is happening in Colombia, you know, so they are the major stakeholders with this conflict. They were, I should talk in the past. There's a lot of talking, of course, about the British intelligence services being involved in this war, and Israel, also the intelligence services. But I wouldn't know like a specific financial support of Britain to the peace process. I think their role in the peace process has been very small. I don't remember any representative of Britain being in Havana, to be honest. But I know that right now for the implementation process, they do support the peace process, and they give financial support to the peace process. So, and there, of course, they also have been pen holders in the Security Council in New York for the Colombian meetings. So they have played a role there. I wouldn't say like a positive role, but they have played the role.
Thanks for that, Tanja. Over to you, Andy.
Also, thank you very much, Tanja, for your talk. And I just looked up the comrade of yours who was killed just now. It's also true that there's been over 1,300 social movement activists, environmentalists, community organizers killed since the ending of the Havana peace talks. And that's kind of like really an intro to my question, which is how do you relate what the FARC was doing to broader social and economic issues, because there's a certain logic to war. We know people have to fight and they get involved in the logic of war, but the roots of the conflict have not gone away, really. I mean, that's a massive challenge for Petro's government. But in Britain's role in the conflict actually was mostly economic. The big mining corporations, the big oil corporations making massive profits out of extractivism from Colombia. So there's an underpinning problem, which is that the economy was off the agenda in Havana. And so that, if what I'm trying to say is the social and economic roots of the conflict have not gone away, nor have the paramilitaries, as you rightly say. I think it would be very interesting for a British audience for you to expand a bit more on who the paramilitaries are, what they do, and why they are so hated. I think that the others' commentary, you can respond to, obviously, but I mean, on the paramilitaries, I think is specific about Colombia, about how cruel ruling class violence through paramilitaries has been.
Have you got
Okay,
that,
so
yeah, go for it.
yeah, Oliver.
No, just a comment and a question there. Over to you.
Okay, yeah. So that's a lot of questions, Andy. That's really a lot of questions. I don't know if I can address everything, but of course, first I would like to say something about economy and about profits that are being made. And I think a major argument, a major reason for making peace in Colombia was specifically to be able to get to those territories where the FARC had control, and we wouldn't want foreign companies to come in and take away the oil or take away the gold. There are a lot of foreign companies, also British companies in Colombia. And of course, for the government, for the Santos government, it was the most important thing was to disarm the FARC and be able to get into those territories and be able to develop neoliberal politics all over Colombia. And also, when we were talking about the first point of the agenda, rural reform, it became very clear for the FARC that the government had red lines. For the FARC, for example, wanted to talk about neoliberal policies. The FARC wanted to talk about mining extraction policies. And that was a red line for the government. There was an ex-minister of mines sitting on the other side of the table, and I don't think he was there. I think he was there on purpose, and it was clear that all the time when the FARC wanted to talk about those kind of subjects, they would cut off and say, this is not for discussion. And then the FARC would say, yeah, we want to speak about free trade agreements. We want to speak about neoliberal politics because that's what we have been fighting against all those years. And then they would say, they were very smart, the government, they would say, okay, so those topics are going to go into a freezer. We will have them into the freezer until just to advance on a peace agreement. And after all the discussions, we're going to get back to those topics the FARC want to discuss. So they wouldn't. They never came back to those points, and expectation from Colombian society was already too high, too big, to be able to prolong the peace talks anymore. So finally, peace was signed without addressing those lists, which were really lists the FARC made after every point of the agenda, but especially rural reform was a huge list on those kind of topics, economic topics, we could say. And there all are already indicators, people, NGOs saying that actually there is a lot of environmental damage being done right now in those areas where the FARC was before. So it is happening what we thought would happen, also relating to what you said about social activists being murdered on the countryside, you said 1,300. I think it's more. I don't know exactly. But yeah, that's something that's still happening, you know. And before, it was very easy to say when somebody would die on the countryside, it's the FARC, it's the FARC. It's always the FARC, you know. But now it becomes slightly more difficult to always accuse the FARC, because of course there's ELN, you can still accuse them of everything. Of course, there are FARC dissidencies. Sometimes FARC dissidencies, paramilitaries, it's not really clear where the distinction is, but people are still being killed for being social activists or for being environmental activists, you know? And why is that? Why is that? There are a lot of communities, for example, who are, how do you say that, demanding the state or demanding companies, because they say the companies hire paramilitaries to get them away from places they don't want people to live, for example, you know. There are many cases of that. And I think through the years, those cases will come out. And actually the truth of the behind the conflict has to come out in some way. And maybe it will take 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, I don't know. But it's like with the CIA documents, you know, they will come out at some point. So the truth has to, and also the truth about the economic roots of this conflict, you know, what economic interests, what economic profits are behind this conflict. That's why for us it was so important to have those third parties involved in the peace tribunal. But the former government excluded them from the peace tribunal, and for obvious reasons, you know. Also, you spoke a little bit, I don't know if that's responding your question, your comment. You said something about paramilitaries. I haven't spoken much about paramilitaries. They, one important aspect of the peace agreement was the dismantling of paramilitary organizations. They were created by the state and by the US. Actually, there are declassified documents from the CIA talking about declassified documents in which it is said that in 1962, a US commander, I believe his name was Jabaro, came to Colombia and actually recommended the creation of paramilitary structures. Those paramilitary structures were created to implement the dirty war the Colombian government couldn't wage against the population because of human rights, because of being accused of human rights violations. So that's why paramilitaries were created. I think at some point, maybe in the 80s, maybe in the 90s, they had started to get out of control, those paramilitaries, and they grew out, like helped by drug trafficking and everything, supported by mafias. They grew out to a huge paramilitary structure that would really, in my viewpoint, degrade the conflicts, you know. And when I say degrade, it's like really it has degraded the conflict. And just to give you an example, which I always remember, at those victims meetings in Havana, there was a woman. So we were sitting in front of the government, and there was a woman who was speaking, telling her experience of victim of the conflict. And she told about soldiers who came to her house and accused her of being a guerrilla fighter. And she was 5 months pregnant, and then they obliged her to walk through the jungle. So she had an abortion, and the soldiers called the dogs, and they made the dogs eat her baby before her eyes, you know. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about degrading the conflict, you know. That's a degraded conflict. And You know, that's not only caused by one party, but I do believe that one party has been the catalyzer of that degradation, and then the other party necessarily responds, you know, and stuff gets really bad. But yeah, I think that's what paramilitaries are.
Thank you very much for that, Tanja. Thanks for a very interesting answer to a very interesting question, Andy. Seeing we've got no other hands up, I hope I can abuse chair's privileges and ask a couple of questions myself. The first question is, you know, based on what you were saying in your talk, the FARC had internal regulations for combating falta de las normas, you know, when people break the rules, for many different reasons. As a guerrilla fighter, as a female guerrilla fighter as well, Tanja, were they reliable? Could you depend on these procedures? You know, if a commander broke a rule, or if a FARC militant broke a rule, could you have confidence that the punishments would be imposed? That's the first question I've got. The second question is related. You said that politically the FARC were defeated, but militarily the FARC weren't defeated. I'm just wondering why the FARC struggled to gain popular support in the urban areas, in the cities, whereas they gained a lot of support in the countryside. Why didn't they manage to expand to the more urban areas? If those two questions are okay to ask.
Okay, so about internal regulations, as a female fighter, if I understand your question, like if I felt protected by those rules, right?
Yeah, that could be that.
Fighter.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for example, yeah.
Yeah, I sure did. Because I knew that, for example, sexual violence would be a secure war council for that person. So that would be a real problem. And, you know, I don't know, not only by those rules, but I also felt protected by daily life. I didn't feel vulnerable within the ranks of the FARC, you know? The only thing I would feel vulnerable about is, for example, female guerrilla fighters would be very scared about getting caught by the army, because you would never know what they would do, you know? Sometimes they would sexually violate guerrilla female fighters, and sometimes they would respect them, but it was very difficult to know what kind of group you would be captured by. So that was our fear. But like inside the ranks of the FARC, it wasn't, for me, it wasn't an issue at all, you know, and we would all have a bath together every day, wearing our underwear, and nobody would even have a look at you. Like it would be all like, hey, could you give me the soap and everything? Like it would be very relaxed, you know. Sometimes they would I don't know, get to your guard duty and say, I like you very much. Would you like to have a relationship with me? No, I don't. Okay, sorry. You know, that would be about it. So like the whole FARC community was not a community like is very often showed in the media, like a very loaded community, like with a very loaded atmosphere, you know, and it wasn't at all like that. It would be very relaxed between men and women. And also like the rules, well, what you said about commanders, you know, when a commander is in command of a unit, it's not always easy to get him to criticize himself or to get punishment for something. So in my block, what the upper commander would do is to call all the people, to listen to all the people and take away the commanders of certain units who had been abusive or who weren't good commanders. And he would like, how do you say that? Recogerlos, like take them with him for a while and just substitute them. That's what he would do. But in general, those rules would be applied. Yeah.
That's interesting.
And your second question is about why didn't we manage to have political support in the cities? I think that's a very interesting question. I think it's a very difficult question as well. There are many answers to it. And I think that's like for a long discussion. But one reason might be that the FARC was a peasant army, you know, and the breach between like the countryside and the cities in Colombia is huge. Like, I mean, the cultural, not breach, how do you say that? La brecha.
The separation. The separation.
Sorry. Yes, the gap. The gap between the countryside and the cities is huge. So there's a cultural gap. There's a political gap even. There's an economical gap. So I think being the FARC a peasant army, like the FARC fighters also were from those communities, the indigenous communities, the Black communities, the peasant communities. So that would be the people they would understand and they would relate to. The FARC, when I joined the FARC, I was part of an urban unit. So first I worked in the city and then I went to the jungle, but I was like the jungle part of the urban unit. I don't know if you understand that. Yeah. So FARC a lot of times tried to set up structures in the cities, and actually FARC did a lot of military work in the cities, like bombings and everything, but also the FARC did a lot of political work in the cities, at the universities, with students, in the neighborhoods. And I would see all those people in my unit who would join the FARC mostly were from the cities, like from poor neighborhoods. Sometimes they would be smoke a lot of marijuana, and they would have very big problems like to adapt to life, to military life, because they would come from very poor neighborhoods in Bogota. But then again, you know, FARC would set up some political work in the cities, and then the state would be very protective in the cities. Like for the state, it was like the countryside. We don't care about the countryside. Only 30 or 25% of the people live on the countryside. We fight against the FARC in the jungle, but we really don't care. Like, but the cities, they have to be protected, you know? And that's why work in the cities was so dangerous. It was so difficult. People had to have like a clandestine life. And all the time those structures would be captured, would be murdered. We would find our people on, how do you say that? Basureros, on trash, like murdered. So it was always like this, you know, trying to set up work in the cities, and we did it badly, and then the government would kill our people, and the rest of the structures would go to the jungle. So that's the story of urban structures of the FARC, which wasn't very successful.
That's really, really helpful, really insightful. And I'll be using some of those comments in my PhD thesis, because it really was a helpful response. We've got time for one more question. I can see Michaela has a hand up. So last question goes to you, Michaela. Over to you.
Sorry, my Zoom's being very slow. Tanja, thanks so much. I really learned so much. I guess my question was more about the kind of ideological element of organizing. So you mentioned a lot of people might come in, and initially it might have been prompted by an experience of poverty or violence. And then they would be part of learning about the FARC's ideology in more depth. And I guess I wonder how you went about that, and how shared you felt and rooted the vision was among commanders, sort of how that would become a shared vision.
Like the political struggle? of the FARC? Like, how would we?
So because my understanding also in how you presented it was some people would join and maybe their personal circumstances were impelling them in the direction of the FARC, but I'm not sure they would sort of arrive with exactly the same thinking as the organization had built up. So I guess I'm just wondering about the integration of fighters, about building up a sense of a common vision, about how shared that vision was, and yeah, how you worked on that over time.
Yeah, like I think in some areas, like the lack of education was also an important reason for us to make peace, to want to go to the peace process. I think the military situation was very difficult under Plan Patriota. There was very little time for education, and if you don't have education within a revolutionary army, you're going to die, you know, as a revolutionary army. So, and especially in a country like Colombia, where there's a lot of drug trafficking, which also brings about its own education, you could say, like its own culture. It's very important, like, to have and to be able to carry out education with your fighters. All fighters, when they arrive to FARC, they would have different levels of ideological preparation, you know. And then it's like the idea was to canalize all those experiences. For example, there would be university students who would know a lot about Marxism. They would know a lot about theory, but they wouldn't understand practice within the FARC. You would see that a lot. Like, many people like fled the FARC desperately because they just didn't understand practice. Like, they didn't understand that FARC was actually made up of people, you know, and they thought everything was perfect and everything is revolutionary, and oh, my comrade, and come here. And like, daily life isn't like that. We're just people, you know. And there's the other way around, like I already talked about, like people who came from very poor neighborhoods, or people from the countryside who just wanted to join the FARC because they didn't have anything to eat, or because they liked weapons. There's also people who joined the FARC because they liked weapons, you know. So they all need kind of a different education, you know. You can't get into the FARC and because out of vengeance, because the state killed your family. You can't do that. First you have to arm your head, and then you can arm, how do you say that, your hands, then you can get a weapon, you know. And so in the FARC, it would be, when there was time for it, it would be very important. We had different courses, like when I joined the FARC, my first course was a course given by Simon Trinidad, who's now prison in the United States, and it was about political economy, Marxist economy. Later on, I would, myself would give courses on Marxist philosophy, on class struggle, on materialism. Materialism, for example, to teach about materialism was a very important way of teaching people to be not superstitious, because that does a lot of harm within a military situation. Like to fight a little bit against, not to fight, like people used to be religious, but at least like teach where religion comes from, how it relates to society, what the church is, and everything, those kind of stuff. But also there was a lot of education on our basic rules, on the agrarian program, and that would be very, how do you say that? Very repetitivo,
repetitive
education. And sometimes I would go crazy with it, because you know, it's not that easy for all people, especially when you're from the countryside, especially when you learned how to read and write within the FARC, when you came to the FARC, and then you have to memorize stuff. It's just being repeated constantly. And that was the way in which people would, and they still do it, you know, sometimes they don't, maybe they don't know why some rules exist, but they are able to memorize those rules and to tell me about those rules and why they should comply with those rules and why and what imperialism is. Maybe they don't understand like everything around it, but they can give you like a proper definition of imperialism, of class struggle, of capitalism, for example. I don't know, there's a lot to say about education as well. I think it's a fascinating subject, you know, and I was in the transition zone. I was in charge of education for the people, and I found it so interesting, like to, I don't know, everything with education is so necessary.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I could ask 5 more questions, but I better leave you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tanja. Apologies, but there's one final question in the chat that I've overlooked. So if are you all right if I just read this last question out to you? Wim says, thanks a lot for your talk. I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little on the current situation. Of course, the Petro government is a very positive development, but do you think anything really changed in the balance of powers in society? Aren't you afraid the Conservatives are really very much entrenched in the whole state apparatus? Moreover, US imperialism didn't really disappear from the scene, did it?
Okay, that's a lot of questions as well. I just want my few months of happiness about this government. I know there could be some skepticism about it. I don't think the balance of powers have really changed in Colombian society. You know, economic power is still in hands of the elites, and they could do something like they did in Venezuela without making any effort, like putting an obstacle to when it gets to revolutionary for them in some way. So yeah, it might not happen. You know, that's a possibility, and also. Like US attitude towards the Petro government gives me a headache. Like I don't really know what to think about it. They've been very quiet, easygoing with the Petro government. For example, Petro already said that the war on drugs has failed, and the US was like, oh yeah, okay, the war on drugs has failed, so what should we do? It's like quite, I don't know. It's not like the US didn't have like the attitude and the words and the actions you would expect, and that makes you think. Like my commander always told me, like if the enemy is talking good about you, then you should worry. You know. So I don't know. I think the Petro government is trying to manage all those powers in society. It's trying to manage the traditional powers. For example, the agreement to buy 3 million hectares from practically from the elites. Let's say, I wanted to say another word, but from the elites, from the big landowners, they're going to buy 3 million hectares from them. I think that's an agreement made out of compromise, you know, to not take them away from them, because then there could be a negative reaction. And I think Petro is playing it very well until now. But of course, I don't think this government is going to really change power structures, but I think it's about taking early measures for him to be re-elected, or for like a government of the people, a popular government being re-elected, and in that way be able to consolidate. But this is only the beginning, I think. And I hope it will continue, of course.
Tanja, thank you very much on behalf of everybody here in the CSSGJ. It was a real pleasure to hear your talk today. Many thank you very much. It was excellent, and it's a pleasure to meet you and to listen to everything you've had to say today. So thank you.
Okay, nice to meet you, all of you. Thank you very much for being here.
That's it for everybody. You can go over to our CSSGJ Eventbrite page. I haven't got the details in front of me, but we'll have another talk coming up very soon, probably next week. Thank you very much, and see you very soon, everybody. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.